start with the intros, etc., and then just get going in the interest of time. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. We are going to get started right now, and I'm just going to run through very quickly what we're hoping to cover off today. We'll be whizzing through some introductions shortly. Then we're going to be having a look at some common challenges that we see clients facing when they're trying to write reports. We're going to look at the fun section that I call FTSE Fusion, redefining professional writing, a fun section called Normal Not Formal. I mean, they're all fun, really. We're going to have a look at how to structure content for impact, and then we're going to run through a few of the nuts and bolts, really, just looking at some of the things that can be really challenging around longer types of documents when you're pulling them together. And then we're going to finish off with questions. We will have a Q&A box that you can add questions throughout the session. We're also got the chat open, so if you want to make responses or comment on things as we go through, we have tried to structure this in the style of one of our writing workshops that we would run for clients in terms of a training session. So interactivity is welcome, and yeah, feel free to add comments or contribute to the conversation as we run through. So moving swiftly along, hello again to all of you who've we've seen before, or to those we've worked with previously, but also welcome to anybody who might not have attended one of our webinars and they were yet to meet. Thank you for being here today. I work at Stratton Craig, and we are a strategic content and copywriting agency based in the centre of Bristol. We work with some of the largest enterprises both in the UK and globally, and we work across a range of industries, so from financial services, professional services, to construction, legal, resources, technology, healthcare, education. We also offer a really wide range of services within content and writing. So we support brands with ongoing content development. We help them develop content strategies. But finally, we're also a specialist ESG and annual reporting agency, and we've written hundreds of annual and sustainability reports, and that's the reason we're here today. So my name is Claire, and I'm head of copy and strategy here at Stratton Craig. I've been with Stratton Craig for 8.5 years now, so I've been doing this for a long time. And I was just thinking this morning, I might never ever update my CV. It might always say over 20 years from now on. There's no need to keep adding the numbers there. But I'd also like to welcome Carly, who's joining us from our sister agency, Black Sun.
Thank you, Claire. Hi, I'm Carly Hardman, Client Services Director at Black Sun. I too have more than 20 years, and I agree with that comment about leaving it just there. Thank you very much. In corporate communications and reporting, basically, essentially at Black Sun, we're all about reporting, communications, and sparking positive stakeholder engagement. So my role is very much about driving exceptional client service in all that we do, across everything that we do at the agency, to really ensure that our clients are really well supported and valued. A little bit about the positive change group that we are part of, along with People Made, and then obviously Black Sun and Stratton Craig. We bring together specialists in reporting, culture, ESG, content strategy, and communications to help leading businesses strengthen trust with their stakeholders. So clients really get deep expertise in writing and corporate reporting, plus access to those broader capabilities as their needs evolve. So the difference is, by being part of the Positive Change Group, is that we connect the dots and we're able to provide all those services under the same kind of family, if you like. So let's get started. So what are the common challenges that we see? Well, through our joint experience, we've seen worked on lots of corporate reports across all industries, for all companies of all different sizes, across lots of different markets, and sometimes all at once. So we've seen firsthand how difficult these projects can be, and we've seen the things that go commonly wrong. So in terms of these little areas, so if we were to ask somebody on the street how they'd expect an annual report to sound, what do you think they'd say? Don't feel free not to chat. But essentially, we often hear things like they're complex, they're complicated. There's lack of structure, there's a loss of flow, and the problem is it loses the reader. They're very technical, and this can be really hard for kind of non-experts and perhaps your customers or clients that you're trying to engage with to understand, meaning you put a huge amount of effort into creating a document that's only suitable for a small or maybe just one audience. Quite often as well, they're formal, and we find ourselves more comfortable in this formal tone, but it can be distracting and it can distance broader audiences. Jargon heavy, I mean, yeah, acronyms, internal speak, it just gets lost. Dull, doesn't focus on the benefits, so it misses the opportunity to really engage. And the big one that we get all the time is they're so repetitive. Now, are you being repetitive or are you reinforcing important content? So we're here because we don't believe they need to be this way. But to figure out how to address some of these problems, you need to understand why and why they've come about. So the big things that we see, and sometimes it is unavoidable because reports are challenging, as we know, but ultimately we've kind of seen multiple writers. When you have lots of different people inputting into the document, they have lots of different writing styles, their own voice, and this can be very obvious when you have all contributing to the same document. And within those writers, there's varying levels of ability. So it goes without saying that in a group, there will be those more confident and skilled at writing than others. The balancing disclosure with storytelling. At the end of the day, nobody publishes a report just because they want to. Often it's because they have to. But we believe that there's an opportunity to tell your story, your company's strategy, achievements, and progress to a broad range of stakeholders. Quite often being cautious about the legal and compliance review. This is a valid concern and not one that we're going to wave away. But too often in trying to play the safe game for legal reasons, companies end up watering down their messaging considerably. Quite often as well, there's just too much to say. This is undoubtedly true. And trying to include everything a company has achieved in the year is generally a mistake. So we talk about including essential, impactful stories, your strongest examples, the achievements you're most proud of. But how do you know what those are? Well, we have some ideas. So in this session, we'll be looking at how the reporting of your report can help address some of the challenges we saw on the previous page. This is not a hard sell on engaging a copywriter and a reporting agency, but if you do, give us a call. This session is very much about coordinating the writing of the report internally and how best to do that. So, and sharing lots of tips and tricks that we hope will be super helpful when you come away from this session. So, but first, I'm going to turn to Claire and we're going to talk about why this matters.
Thank you, Carly. I think it's really important to note there as well that although not everybody is going to be able to be a professional writer or even want to be, we think that almost anybody's writing can be improved just in a few small ways. And we're going to try and focus on some of those things today. But first, I wanted to have a little look at why this is becoming a bit of a problem, I think, for people writing reports. Because when it comes to the reports, and admittedly, we do see a lot, but it can really feel like that you're looking really navigating a sea of same. So everyone's saying the same things, they're using the same kind of language. You can't really tell one company from another, no matter how different their area of expertise or what they do is. And I think this is partly because of that tendency to use what I'm going to call corporate waffle. So this is a definition according to the Cambridge Dictionary. So either it's a tasty breakfast treat served with maple syrup, that's not the one we're talking about, or it means to write, talk or write a lot without giving any useful information or clear answers. Now, you can think that this is just the way businesses sound, and it isn't a problem because everybody else is sounding the same, so why does it matter? But there really is a danger to this kind of waffle because it damages trust. People can tend to assume that if someone isn't explaining something clearly, it means one of two things. Either they don't know what they're doing, or they do know what they're doing, but they're trying to hide it from you. And you see that a lot with another type of section of society who tends to use waffle. It's people like politicians. When they're trying not to answer a question clearly, they'll kind of use this kind of language that talks around an issue and doesn't really address it head on. So on this slide, I've included some examples from a soft drink company, a bank, a beer company, and a food producer. But you would be really struggling to tell which is which because they all sound exactly the same in the way they're talking about their ambitions, and the work they're doing around their companies. So again, you'd expect an element of this because they're addressing the same audience, investor audience, but you can just see how it becomes so repetitive, so samey in terms of all of the content. We also see companies using complicated language which does not say much at all. I'm going to read this out and I'll do my funny phone voice. Our ambition is to embed purpose in every part of our group. To ensure this happens, our purpose is embedded within our existing corporate governance framework and processes, and these support appropriate levels of oversight and integration of ESG topics across the entire group. So, this sentence is grammatically correct, and as far as we know, factually accurate, but it's long winded and repetitive and really complex, and it just isn't clear what it's trying to say. But with a few small changes, it's relatively easy to fix and increases the clarity considerably. I'll give you a second to read that. I won't do my silly phone voice for this one. Um, but we've just simplified the language on the right-hand side, made it a much more active piece by using verbs we want to embed, not our ambition is to, and then really cut down that second part to be a bit clear about why we're doing this. So hopefully you can see with just these small changes, we've really simplified the content without changing the message. And this is a kind of corporate waffle that we see too much of in reporting. We will strive to ensure that we can continue to improve our sustainability and performance. You know, that sentence could have been about half that size. But there is a reason why we tend to reach for language like this in these kinds of formal settings. And I'm going to go into that now in a section I'm calling Redefining Professional Writing. So, building on that point, our tendency to resort to corporal waffle in certain environments, I've got some examples I'd like to share to you. What does everyone make of this sign? You can do, if we're allowed to do reactions, you can do thumbs up, thumbs down if you want to, or do it in the chat if you need to. Um, because this was a sign that was up at Piccadilly Circus at peak hour. And presumably it was intended for drivers driving through, and it says pedestrian casualty reduction signal timings experiment. But it makes no sense because it's a collection of nouns. There's literally no instruction here. There's no context about why this is relevant. There's no explanation about what they want the reader of the sign to do. It would be about as effective as a sentence saying laptop, apple, drink bottle, mouse, pointing at things on my desk. You know, there's literally no reason to read it or know what to do. But I think they actually wanted something more like this. Take care, new traffic light timings in place. So I have an idea about what's happened here, and it's something called the curse of knowledge. This is Steven Pinker, a cognitive psychologist and science author, and his idea around the curse of knowledge is that the more we know and the more we're surrounded by experts who know the same things as us, so really immersed in our subject matters, the harder it is for us to see what a layperson will or won't understand. We become so used to our own internal language that we forget that it doesn't make sense to anybody else. And this means that when you're speaking to an audience outside that group, you need to be extra doubly careful of using jargon because our definition of jargon is likely far too narrow, and we've probably lost sight of what will or won't make sense to other audiences. And if you go back to the silly sign, signal timings is an example of jargon used in sense with a curse of knowledge. So maybe engineers and, traffic engineers will be using signal timings when the rest of us just say a traffic light. So that's an example of that curse of knowledge in place. I'm going to share this other one here, which I do enjoy. And this is, I'll read it out because it's a bit hard to see with that video, that picture quality. Span 4 is the heading. I wonder who that's for. I would like to apologize for the increase in noise levels you will experience in this area. It is part of the enabling works to Span 4 roof, which will bring the original roof back into public view for the first time in over 15 years. Roof support columns need to be shielded to allow work upon them, and this will restrict concourse areas in the short term. So again, for context, this was at Paddington Station. The picture was taken at peak hour, and it was on a concourse on a pedestrian. So passengers were, this was targeted at passengers. But with a title like Span 4, it's really unlikely that people are going to realize that. They're not going to understand who that's for, and you're not going to stop and read it. I love this piece because there's a really nice little, story about roof columns, but somebody rushing through on peak hour isn't going to stop and read a lovely piece around roof columns. Span 4, again, indicates that the person who wrote this was a little bit too close to the project and had forgotten that nobody walking past is going to understand what span 4 means in terms of this situation. So again, it's another example of jargon creeping in without the author realizing it. Instead, what they could have said is something like, sorry for the noise, we're fixing the roof. A much simpler, much clearer message. So I'm going to now share another example, which is a completely different. What do we all think of this slide? If you hit this sign, you will hit that bridge. Do we like it? Do we think it's effective? It certainly clearly tells people what to do and what they need to know, and it does it in a really quick and impactful way. But do we think it's professional? Probably not. I mean, firstly, it looks like it's been pegged to that little line and probably put up by the person in that church after the last time somebody hit the bridge ahead. But this is a really effective piece of communications. If you think about what it is you need them to do, what you need them to understand in as fast a time as possible, this is very impactful. But this is not what we tend to reach for when we're thinking about how to sound professional. So obviously, I'm not suggesting that this is how we need to sound in a corporate report, but I do want to challenge the idea that to sound professional, you have to sound dense and wordy and overcomplicated. Actually, I think effectiveness of communications should be the first priority. So again, it's really important, I think, to understand why we end up reaching for that language that doesn't resonate with our readers and doesn't help explain what we're trying to. And the reason goes back into history. So this wonderful island has been invaded significantly, well, several times actually, but really significant times by the Romans in 54 BC and then the Normans in 1066. And both times the invaders brought new languages with them, but both times only a portion of the population learnt those new languages. And typically it was the elites, the educated, the clergy, the aristocracy, which meant that everybody else continued to speak the Anglo-Saxon languages of old, while the upper classes essentially began to use Latin and French more significantly. And we can still see the after effects of this in our language today. Those words we tend to reach for when we're trying to sound educated, knowledgeable, formal, are those words that have their origin in Latin and French. Um, and the problem with that is it is distancing language. It's language that was sort of designed to separate the upper classes from the lower classes. And it can feel like that when you use that language to somebody. So I'll give you an example. If I were to shout down to my husband right now, because he's heading to the shop, I'm probably not going to say, Dearest one, when you next frequent a retail establishment, could you procure on my behalf a Twix? And furthermore, one requires milk and bread. What would it make you think about me? It would probably make you think I'm aloof, snobby, a bit of a nightmare, a bit of a pain. Again, it's not an impression you'd want to convey in that situation. So why is it one we try and convey in formal writing, in corporate writing? So here are some of the usual suspects. Um, Again, the obvious ones: utilize, require, obtain, request, assist. These are the Formal English words we tend to reach for, the ones that have their origins in Latin and French. And by using the much more plain language, you will sound more authentic, more human, and it tends to be simpler in terms of sentence structures. Now, the reason why we do this is because we are sort of leaning into that sense of distancing of that language. But the problem is, it doesn't make us sound more intelligent, authoritative, or credible. In actual fact, it has the opposite effect. But you don't have to take my word for it. This has actually been proven. This is a cute little title page of a paper written by Daniel Oppenheimer. So he was a professor at Princeton, and he wrote this research paper called The Consequences of Erudite Vernacular Utilized Irrespective of Necessity, or the plain version, The Problems with Using Long Words Needlessly. So he had noticed that his first year students were using really long, complicated language in their essays to make it sound like they had a better grasp of the subject matter than they actually did. Something that my university lecturers used to call glittering generalities, and I was definitely guilty of it. So he did a test to see if it actually made those papers appear more intelligent, and he rewrote several papers into a plain English version and then a much more complicated, more formal version, and tested both versions with a really broad audience. The plain English ones consistently rated as more intelligent, more persuasive than the others. So the upshot of this is that using that language doesn't actually make you sound smart, but it's probably what we're all trying to do when we do use it. Um, Oppenheimer won a Nobel Prize for this paper for literature in 2006. But this can be a useful thing to refer to because sometimes our clients report to us that, although they believe in plain writing, they'll get a lot of pressure from people internally who think, oh, to sound lawyerly, we have to use this kind of language, or to sound corporate and professional, we must speak like this. Actually, it's sometimes undoing your communications objectives. And if your communication objective is to communicate as clearly and as impactfully as possible, that's really the kind of language you need to avoid. So, how do we make sure we aren't slipping into this language by accident? It's pretty easy. The test is to read your writing aloud to yourself. And if you start sounding like I did when I was commanding my husband to get me a Twix, or if you just sound like you're putting on a funny old phone voice, then it might be that your writing has become too formal. And you can pull it back by substituting some of those simpler words that I shared earlier. So the next thing I want to have a look at, and Carly mentioned this earlier, around content for reports can tend to really miss a lot of the benefits or the why something matters. And our really strong feeling is that if people have short attention spans, we need to make sure that we're capturing their attention as quickly as possible and that we're putting the most impactful messages up front and we're structuring the content in a way that people can engage with it as easily as possible. Now, here's a cute little quote we like as well. This is a chap called Theodore Levitt. He's an economist from the 1950s, in case you couldn't tell by the beard and the moustache. Sorry, the moustache and the suit. Ugh. And he said, people aren't looking to buy an item, they want the benefit that that item brings. So people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want the quarter-inch hole that it drills in their wall. You don't buy that to hang it on your wall and look at it, you buy it for what it does for you. To put that in terms of, a more pedestrian item, um, when you buy a jumper, you might say, I bought a green woolly jumper with a boxy shape, but you've brought a jumper that you think is stylish, or it goes with others in your wardrobe, or it's going to keep you warm, or it's really comfortable. So those are the sort of benefits that it conveys. And if we're not thinking about, I guess, what it is people really want from our content, there's a real opportunity, missed opportunity in terms of drawing out the so what or the why. So applying this to our content, our context of annual reporting, people don't download an annual report just because they want it. It's about what that comms can do for them, what information it gives them, what they can learn about a company as a result of it. And the way we need to make sure we're sort of putting our readers first and thinking about what they need from our communications is by always asking, so what? I'm going to run through a few examples of how we can apply that to the kinds of language that we see in reports. But the so what is really what helps you get to the benefit. So if you've made a statement, ask so what and see whether you can tease out why that's going to be important to your reader. And some examples here are run through. So supply chain challenges continue to impact the widgets division. Well, so what? Why is that going to be interesting to people? And it might be that you need to explain that. That's made it harder to source the materials we need to make widgets, and it's also made it harder to keep up with distributed demand for widgets. We expect this to continue until X date, but we have put these measures in place to mitigate the issue. So by asking so what and delving into that a little bit more, you can change a fairly flat statement, which feels like it's probably not saying enough to your audience and might be hiding information behind that, to really explaining here's the impact of it. Here's a transparent view of how we think it's going to impact the business, but here's also what we've done about it. So again, you can see there's a real opportunity to sort of dive into this and make the content richer and more informative. We have significantly expanded the scope and detail of our ESG data capture. Well, so what? That might be fine and it's true and it's a fact that you've done, but without explaining why you've done that, it's just not going to be as engaging to your audience. So the way you could dive into that a little bit more would be, we're doing this so we can get a clearer picture of where we are in real time. That's going to let us form a really detailed baseline against which we're going to measure our progress so that we know that we're achieving what we set out to achieve. And it's also going to help us target our initiatives more effectively. So again, you can see by adding a little bit more context and really explaining why that makes a difference, you've made that content a lot more rich. The other question we can ask sometimes is why, and I think there's a famous TED talk about this. Um, we enabled customers to receive mortgage offers within 24 hours. Well, why does that matter? Why is that important to the business? And that could be for that circumstance. It's we identified that lengthy approval times were hampering our customers' ability to move on home purchases. And by offering mortgages more quickly, we can provide mortgages to more people. So there's a really good reason behind that. But unless you've teased it out, these statements sound very flat and not very persuasive. And then finally, in June 2065, we acquired a 7.6 squillion, that's the impact of inflation, UK prime mortgage portfolio from Nonsense Bank. So again, these are the kinds of statements we see all the time in reports, but without explaining why that makes a difference or why that decision has been made, it's just not as persuasive as it could be. So this one you could really bulk out a little bit with things like, it was a really good fit for our existing product or customer profile. We've significantly expanded into new markets. There's a few different ways you could do that there. So hopefully you can see that by really digging into why this information matters, it can help you identify what's most important to your audience, and therefore also make your content a lot more engaging for them. You can tell I'm a bit too passionate about it. I'm running out of breath. Um, so this is a structure that journalists will use. And again, it's that sense of knowing that our audience has a time poor. They're not going to have a lot of time to read a lot of the content we write. So we make sure that we put the most important thing first and we dive straight into it. And that means if they haven't gotten all the way through to the end of the content, it doesn't matter because we really prioritized what they needed to know and made sure that we caught their attention with it. Now, I have definitely talked too much, so I am going to hand over to Carly to close us off with the nuts and bolts section.
Thank you, Claire. Super interesting insights there. So now turning to very, very important, not at all boring, bits and bobs that we think often trip up companies when they're working on these lengthy documents. So in a document with lots of people contributing, we often find that it's incredibly common for the Frankenstein version to come about. So everybody's different styles and preferences kind of all being bolted on to the report. And there's ways to avoid that. I mean, just making sure that you have a company style guide and a tone of voice in place, so that but often, even when we find people do have these, there are varying levels of compliance, shall we say. Another tip, I suppose, is to have a detailed structure and content outline for each section. So this can go a step deeper than a page plan, but it can really help to minimize the repetition. And it ensures that any repetition is really purposeful. It's reinforcing a point rather than just repeating it. So to help with that, there's a pro tip, if you like, having a professional proofread, content review or a copy polish can really bring fresh eyes when your authors have kind of become copy blind. And failing that, there are things that we often see popping up again and again that take the polish off an otherwise excellent report. So turning to some of these kind of tips and tricks, if you like, currency styles. So do you do GBP or currency symbol? Abbreviations for millions, billions. Gosh, we're getting into the detail now, aren't we? Contractions, we will or won't we? See what we did there. Now, both options are fine, but it should be a decision about what's right for you and your company, your audience, and the tone that you're trying to strike. Bullet formatting, like any style question, it's just about consistency, and attention to detail and a focus on quality is what you really want your report to kind of come across as. Headings and structures. Have you used really eye-catching headlines in one part of the report and then not elsewhere? Is some text broken up by subheads to aid readability? That can really help to guide the reader, but it can also help with AI too. First person, third person. Again, there are valid reasons to do both, but choose one and go with it. And decide consciously what's best for your report, your audience, not because it's what most people did. So let's review where we got to. What are our key learnings from the session today? Well, be aware of the curse of knowledge. You may not even recognize jargon anymore. Overly formal language could be drowning your messages and alienating your audiences. So think about your audience and put their priorities first and review the document as a whole for those common pitfalls and errors that we've chatted through. But if you do want more help, defining your content strategy can be really helpful. Ensuring that you know what you want to be famous for, you know what those key messages are, and you're ensuring that all of your writers do as well. Putting together those content guidelines and structured outlines that I just mentioned, a tone of voice review and recommendations, targeted writing training for report contributors, so everybody's getting the same guidance at the start of the project, or appointing people to do a copy polish, so reviewing to align tone and style across your report, or doing an interim review of partially completed report content. So we hope that's been super helpful, sharing lots of different insights, but we are open to questions if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, either myself or Claire or both of us.
Thanks, Carly. Now, I can't see any questions coming through, but that might just be because of my deficient settings. So if anybody else sees some, do shout out. Oh, there's Q&A. Here we go.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't see any questions coming through so far. I will assume that's because we have done everything perfectly. But if anybody does think of any questions in the next few days, we'd love to hear from you, obviously. And we're always happy to answer questions around best practice, or our views on writing. And yes, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that was helpful for you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.